You've had a spiritual awakening or a deep spiritual experience, but instead of feeling aligned, balanced, and happy, nothing really makes sense anymore. You disconnect from friends, family, and colleagues. This is such a painful phase of the spiritual awakening process, but it's crucial that you navigate these waters carefully, or you will risk losing your family, your job, and your friends, and at the end of this road, a truckload of regret and disappointment will hit you. But don't worry, because we've got your back. In this episode about the spiritual ego, we share our own awakening experiences and our own dark night of the soul. And we give you spiritual tips, tools, and strategies that you need to make it through the night and into the warm sunlight of grounded spirituality. Welcome to Spirit Matters, a show helping modern seekers navigate the sometimes muddy waters of spirituality with a spiritual heart-centered approach. Inspired by the teachings of Sri Chinmoy, we invite you to stay present here and now, see the divine in everything, and surrender to life as it unfolds. Hey, and if you value the content that we put out, please help us in good podcasting style by subscribing and rating our show in your favorite podcast app. Now let's dive in. So today we are going to talk about a problem that many spiritual seekers go through at some point in their spiritual journey, and that's the emergence of spiritual ego. And usually spiritual ego emerges after a spiritual breakthrough or a deep spiritual experience or a spiritual awakening. And basically what we mean by spiritual awakening is that moment when you realize that your current paradigm, the materialist paradigm, that the world is just this three-dimensional place, no longer holds true. Like you've had an experience, you've felt something of your higher nature, and it's just simply impossible for your current paradigm to survive. And that's when you wake up, as we speak. But that waking up is not all just a bed of roses, and it very often is paired to experiencing great isolation, experiencing feeling estranged from the world, feeling the world is, you don't feel at home anymore in the world. You also feel distanced often from your near and dear ones and people at work, and people perceive you also as sometimes acting strange or uncommon. And there's all these, let's say, problems that come together with this spiritual breakthrough or spiritual awakening. And one of those problems is the emergence of spiritual ego. So, Vajan, what is spiritual ego?
It is separativity and individuality.
Yes, that's ego, but then we have this very interesting variant, the spiritual ego, and that kind of seems to cling to our new belief system, the spiritual belief system. And I guess for ego, it doesn't really matter what it clings to, as long as it has something to identify with and something to feel proud of and feel as its identity. And of course, if you become a spiritual person, then your ego will also cling to that. But there's I think, also some traps that are linked to the spiritual ego.
Yeah,
don't you think?
And I think it is just simply a case of the everyday common old ego that was around since the beginning of time. The great thief, as Sri Chinmoy often talked about, the ego. It was a thief inside the building.
What is it stealing?
Well, it's stealing your true nature. It's hiding your true treasure from you, the true treasure that you are something transcendent and interconnected. And instead, it's taking that away from you, and in its place, it's giving you a sense of smallness and limitation.
But wait a minute, I thought I just had a spiritual breakthrough, so I didn't realize that I was this big interconnected thing, and now my ego runs with that.
Yeah, so this is the thing. So once Shinjimui often use this great analogy that like your being is like a building which has many floors. And at some point, if you've spotted the ego on one floor, then he can't hide out on that floor anymore, but he just simply goes up to the next floor up. And so this, I think, is the case of what we're talking about here with the spiritual ego. That to start with, you were proud of your money power or your ability as a musician or your status or any of those outer trappings of success. But once the ego sees that you're onto it, it says, oh, no, we're not playing that game anymore. No, I've totally gone away. Now we're playing the game of realization and becoming a great spiritual aspirant and great spiritual seeker. But it can be using the same exact techniques of trying to, by hook or by crook, achieve its goals, but just simply it's changed the game. It's moved to a different floor.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about the spiritual ego is that the same mechanics or dynamics of feeling superior, that is one of the ego's qualities, right? It wants to feel a little bit better than the rest of the world. And paradoxically, once we become truly spiritual, we are supposed to become more humble, right? We're supposed to experience more the oneness with the rest of the world. But then the tricky thing is the ego will feel in that spiritual self, will feel some sense of superiority. So you'll feel a little bit better than the rest of the world just because you are conscious, because you are meditating, you're spiritually practicing, you are evolving, whereas the rest of the world seems to stand still. And then this sense of superiority is very subtle. So I think in the spiritual ego sense, it's much more subtle than the, let's say, the ordinary ego that identifies with name and fame and status and all these things.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I totally agree with you on that. And so what I was just thinking about with the spiritual ego is that the ego will often make us either feel smaller than the smallest or larger than the largest. It'll one moment it'll make us feel like we're the worst person on the planet, and the next moment it'll decide that no, we're the greatest thing that's ever happened to the universe. And when that type of overestimation and underestimation of our capacity comes into the spiritual life, it makes for some really interesting dynamics. And it really reminds me of this really funny Zen story I heard about two Zen teachers coming together. And one of the Zen teachers had written many books on Zen. And so the other Zen teacher said to him, "Oh, I see you are a great authority on Zen." And the first one trying to out Zen him said, "No, no, no, I'm simply a leaf being blown on the wind." And so it was like they were playing a competitive game of how small and humble they could be. Was also using that same sort of competitiveness and trying to one up each other, but they were trying to do it in the game of humility. So
Yeah.
it's a tricky thing. It's an insidious problem. This one you've
Well, exactly. And I think in the spiritual sense, it is problematic because it isolates you. And I remember actually I had a period where I've experienced this very, very acutely after my spiritual awakening or spiritual breakthrough. This was actually in the late 90s when I was started to practice meditation and had some very deep experiences. And then I also joined our current community, the Sri Chinmoy Center, and I had many deep experiences with my guru, and it was all happening on in the inner planes, but I was feeling it and I was having all these beautiful deep meditations. But at the same time, I was still the same person, in many respects. Like when you have deep spiritual experiences, they don't change you or transform your nature overnight. And so that is why it kind of clashes in very often with your normal day-to-day life. At the time I was studying in the acting academy in Amsterdam, I was studying to become a professional actor. And I was surrounded by, the acting world is a world of large egos. Let's say that it's like a really sometimes a bit of a dog eat dog mentality, and it can be very challenging, especially when you're developing spiritually. It was a very challenging situation to be in, and my response was that I started isolating myself. So whenever I could, whenever I had a moment to myself, I looked for an empty classroom and I went in there and I started either meditating or maybe reading a spiritual book or just I felt comfortable just being alone, and I felt very uncomfortable in that group setting. And then also this very subtle feeling of superiority also crept in. I also felt, oh, they are not practicing, they don't know this other reality. And so this kind of subtle pride enters, and it's like this kind of toxic cocktail in the end. I had to actually do that year again. Like I was called out because you can't really function that way. You can't just, in a normal classroom setting, it just doesn't work. So I had to redo that first year. And actually it was a total blessing in disguise because the second time I did the year, it was my first year there, everything clicked into place. So I had this wonderful feeling of spiritual integration where it kind of landed. The spiritual experiences landed. I became kind of normal in my day-to-day behaviors. And then it was really such a beautiful and amazing year where everything clicked together and I was able to connect and interact on a much better level than before. So It's also this phase, from caterpillar to butterfly, where you go to this cocoon phase. The caterpillar at some point feels something stir within him, and then he starts to build this cocoon. And that's very much the beginning of your spiritual practice, when you feel you have to isolate yourself a little bit from the world. That also has a function. Like, it is actually useful for some time to build a cocoon, because you have to grow your wings, sometimes in solitude. And so that's what the caterpillar does. He builds his cocoon, he isolates himself, and then after some time, the cocoon breaks open, and it's a liberated soul. It's a butterfly and can fly away. It's a completely changed being. So for me, that first year was very much that cocoon phase, where I had to kind of grow and develop my wings, and I still had to feel my way around combining these realities, and had this real conflict inside of me. And also, when you go through this kind of chaotic transformation, it's much harder when you're in an environment that doesn't really support that. So, in the late 90s, we didn't have 150 podcasts about spiritual ego that you could check out, or you didn't have, it was even frowned upon to meditate in those days. I mean, it was kind of looked on as you're building castles in the air. Whereas nowadays, spirituality is so mainstream. Back then, it wasn't, and so that made it all the more harder. But yeah, I have really felt the problems of that spiritual ego, and how it very often comes to the fore after having a spiritual breakthrough. So we want to also invite our listeners, to what can they do to integrate properly those experiences.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a really interesting place to be going through that type of experience as well. An acting school, a drama school, where they're teaching you to put on different masks. They're teaching you to develop your ability to create a persona. So it's almost, of course, the ego and the persona is going to be amplified in that type of environment. And I always find that so interesting for me when I see people who are deeply involved in the acting world, because I find it hard enough just to keep up the facade of the one character I'm playing, let alone having to switch between many other characters, in my day-to-day life, or, in my working life. And yeah, I remember one of the great actors of recent times, Jim Carrey, was talking about that at some point he thought to himself, well, who's Jim Carrey? He's just another one of the many characters that I've been playing over these years. And that brought about a real deep spiritual revelation and insight for himself. But if we go back to why this problem occurs, I really think the foundational problem is ignorance. So ignorance about the true nature of reality. So ignorance is when we're not seeing reality as it truly is. So we have the spiritual experience, we have a glimpse behind the curtain, and we see that everything is magical and interconnected and profound in a way that most people are not when they're interacting just with the superficial reality around them. But we forget that everyone is also has that all of the other beings, every other portion of consciousness around us is also deeply interconnected to that same reality. So we're seeing separation where separation is not really existing. And so that's our first mistake, that we've had a glimpse and we've overvalued our own position relative to everyone else. Because that's the thing, if you take the position that you've woken up, you've become illumined in some way, you're immediately putting everyone else in a lower position as an unawakened person. And so that's a real dangerous situation to put yourself in, because it's much better to see everyone as playing the role that they're meant to be playing. If you see that they're doing exactly what they're meant to be doing for their character and for the development of their soul and the journey that they're on, then there's not a sense of judgment. It's not like, oh, well, I'm somehow ahead, or those people are somehow behind, or, someone else is ahead of me. It's like, no, everyone is exactly where they're meant to be for this cosmic drama to be acting out in the best possible way. And so that's always my first thing, is trying to understand and see things as they actually are. And my position is always that the universe knows far better than I do, than my limited self, than my character knows where I should be or how other people should be acting.
But for many seekers, that this kind of spiritual breakthrough is a momentous occasion in their life, where they go from not knowing or thinking this is all there is, until somehow getting that glimpse. But I mean, how can you have the maturity at that point to see that, oh, everybody actually is going through the same thing, and you do feel elevated for a moment because you feel touched by God, by the divine, by source. And so
Yeah.
it's very hard to put some relativity into that.
Yeah, what I think, and I know Sri Chinmoy has also talked about this, is that the most powerful thing you can do, and the most useful thing you can do when you have a profound experience, is be incredibly grateful for it. So really, that is the time to really start practicing your gratitude practice, because there's a great idea in many religious traditions that you cannot yourself create a deeply profound religious or spiritual experience. It's not your doing, and instead it's grace coming down from above and or coming from within. And so in that moment, you should be incredibly grateful, like, wow, I'm so feel so blessed and honored and grateful that I was given this experience. It wasn't my doing, it wasn't me that somehow achieved it by my own greatness. And instead it is a completely different type of experience that you should end up feeling more humble afterwards from doing that gratitude practice. So when you have that type of experience, I think Sri Chinmoy recommended that if you can offer gratitude for 5 minutes, just 5 minutes every day after that, for that experience and for the blessings that you've received in your life, that will help you to grow what Sri Chinmoy would call the humility plant, like to start growing this deep, putting these roots of humility down into the ground. And I think that becomes a real protection against this type of tendency.
There was a spiritual master who was famous for, sometimes he felt that after long and deep meditations, he had some spiritual pride, some spiritual ego. And he would go out into the street and he will find the lowliest street beggar and he would throw himself at the street beggar's feet, just out of pure humility, like make himself lower than the lowest and touch the feet of the beggar. And in that way, he felt, I got rid of that toxic pride and I kind of feel myself again. That's a very radical thing, but to kind of go out and interconnect with people, at their own level, and get off your high spiritual horse for some time, and just to have some chit chat. Value also the small things. They also have meaning. They also the small talk and just the normal social interactions. They do have some value, and so to kind of interact with that and not just be in your own cloud nine.
Yeah, and I think oneness is one of the other great cures to this problem, because when you can start to expand yourself from that limited sense of individuality and separativity, and start feeling everyone else around you, their achievements, their goodness, their greatness is also um, part of you. And as soon as you start to do that, you start to see the world in a different way. When you are consciously trying to see the goodness in all of the other beings and people around you, suddenly you start to see those things and they start to reveal themselves to you. And when you can start to celebrate and claim all of the successes and all of the achievements of everyone around you, you stop getting caught up in that false sense of identification with your own achievements, and you start to expand into something greater, which is another way of going beyond the limitations of the individuality and the ego.
Yeah, well, beautiful. And I think another good thing to do is to read spiritual books, to read spiritual texts. I mean, that can also be a trap in a sense if you only start reading spiritual texts. But to read also frames your experience, because when you have a spiritual breakthrough, sometimes if you have a spiritual practice, you may have more of a framework for it. But if you don't, if it happens to you kind of out of the blue, which happens to some people, then reading spiritual books will give you a framework for that experience. And that also helps you to put it in its proper place and to also realize this is something that thousands, if not millions of people have at some point in their lives. That people have spiritual experiences, and there are many more people than you think. And I realized that when I started to give classes, meditation classes, that there were so many people in those classes that had had really deep spiritual experiences. Maybe they had one, but that kept them coming back and back again and again to the practice. So it's something that is more common, I think, than we usually assume.
Yeah, I mean, I just on Saturday in my music store, I had a gentleman who came in and we were chatting about some things, and I saw he had a flower of life tattoo on his arm, and the flower of life is one of the oldest sacred geometric symbols. It goes back 11, 12,000 years. And I said to him, "Oh, what does the flower of life mean to you?" And he told me this amazing story that one day he just got called. It was like early in the morning, it was still dark, and he got called, "Get up and make a cup of tea." So he got up and walked to the lounge, made a cup of tea, and he lived in a place where he was overlooking the ocean. And then he made the cup of tea, and then he just got this voice inside that said, "Go stand outside." So he had no reason not to, so he walked outside. And he was looking out towards the sun was going to be where the sun was going to be rising, but the sun had not risen yet. And then suddenly he saw this ball of golden light on the horizon, and it was very small to start with, but then it started rapidly rushing towards him, at some incredible velocity. And at some point, it got close. It was this ball of golden light, and it came and it went straight through his heart. It burst through his heart, went out his back, went through his house, and then like swung around and like came through his side. And at some point, he ended up inside this ball of golden light. And inside, he could see these, amazing geometric patterns and all of this shape. And this was just a guy telling me, some experience he'd had. It was like you can never predict the depth or the profundity of what other people have seen and felt and experienced. And I've just been seeing that over and over again, especially in the last few weeks. And so it makes me really humble. It makes me feel that, wow, everyone here is having profoundly interesting
Wow.
experiences.
What did that experience have to do with the flower of life?
Yeah, well, yeah, that was his question. He'd never come across, he didn't really know what the flower of life even was. And so the flower of life is seen as being a symbol that represents the fundamental building blocks of reality. It's like, what is reality actually built of? And so we see it as a two-dimensional flat image, but it's actually a two-dimensional representation of a three-dimensional structure, which is the fundamental building block of reality. And he suddenly realized after this experience of being inside this golden globe, which of the flower of life, that he had seen this or heard of this before. So he ran inside and he actually had this book about the sacred significance of the flower of life, which he'd never actually read. And when he started reading it, he found inside it that there was a meditation practice they recommend, which was actually the meditation practice he had started doing, but from a completely different source. So all of these interesting interconnecting threads exist in everybody's lives. And a lot of people don't perhaps have the opportunity or have not had the chance to frame their story in a way that makes sense for them. Because often if you've had some sort of deeply profound experience, it doesn't fit into your day-to-day experiences. It doesn't match with the other experiences you've had in your life. So you don't quite know how to make sense of it. And maybe because of that, you kind of forget about it. You kind of think, well, I don't really know what it means. So you kind of put it away somewhere until perhaps you have another experience or something reveals what was actually going on. And so I think it's always it is a real danger for people to both overestimate their standing and their capacity, but also to underestimate. So obviously, underestimating your capacity is a terrible thing, because it takes away all your confidence, it takes away your joy, it takes away your opportunities to connect with other people because you feel insecure and small. But also, overestimating your own greatness has its own pitfalls, as you've mentioned. And I don't think people are quite commonly aware of the dangers of that, especially when you start playing in the spiritual space, because you often see it, like we were talking in a recent episode, that it's very easy to put on the mask of a yoga face, let's say, where you wear the outfit and you've got the vocabulary, and that very often can be coming from strongly from a place of ego. Because I think very often the most deep and profound people, they see no need to put on a costume to show their spirituality. And our guru himself, he very, very often would not be interested in wearing any overtly spiritual garb. He would love wearing tracksuits or wearing shorts and polo shirts, and he was loved a much more casual style. And for some specific events, he would wear his dhoti and kurta. And very often it seemed it was more for us, his students, than it was for him. He didn't really even see or feel the need to actually have to put on a costume to show his spirituality.
Yeah.
But very often for all of us, it's very often you see that people, when they start getting into spirituality, there's a certain sort of style or outfit or costume that people start taking on. And a good thing to question and ask yourself, is that really me that is calling out to dress like that, or am I trying to show something? Am I trying to show my membership of a group, right? Am I trying to prove something or show something to the world? So
Yeah, exactly. Um, Another thing that the spiritual ego, or that a spiritual awakening or spiritual experience brings about, is that sometimes actually people lose their purpose. They feel that life is meaningless. I've read some things, some threads online from people who are saying, "Oh, after my spiritual awakening, I feel that nothing makes sense anymore. That life is meaningless and useless." That is a very strange thing to discover, that you have this amazing spiritual experience or spiritual awakening, and all of a sudden you feel that life makes no sense anymore. Life is meaningless. How do you explain that?
yeah, well, I mean, there is a very profound realization that everything is empty and meaningless. Like everything is simply a happening. Everything is stars are being born and dying, galaxies, are forming and then collapsing back in on themselves. So if you look at it from a very transcendent and elevated perspective, you see that all of the comings and goings of civilizations and families and individuals, all of this is, in the greatest sense, empty and meaningless because it's just a fleeting moment in an inordinately long span of time. So it's like, well, what does any one particular experience
So
mean?
where is the meaning?
Yeah, exactly. So the really interesting thing for me, which is really powerful, is when you realize that everything that has happened to you and everything that will happen, all of the meaning, like whether it was a good thing or a bad thing, whether it's a tragedy or a wondrous thing, is all being created by you. You're creating the meaning of all of those experiences in your life, and you're telling yourself a story through your lived experience of reality. And so then you see it's not a fixed thing. It's not fixed that, okay, my life is a terrible life or my life is a great thing. It's changing depending on your lens that you're experiencing it through. So it actually frees you from the past. It frees you from the stories and the conditioning and the upbringing and the tragedies and the things that you've experienced. When you can have that type of realization, it allows you to let go of all of those things and start to really author your own story from that point onwards, and really become the boat that is passing through time, and it's creating the past behind you rather than being a victim of time. You become the master of it.
But can you give a
Okay.
concrete example of that? Like when you have this kind of breakthrough and you feel like, oh, everything is empty and meaningless. Like how do you build meaning from that?
Yeah, so I mean, it is an unsettling place to be, and that's when people start to feel. That's when people struggle with that, is because if you don't have a background and an overarching understanding of perhaps what type of universe you're living in, if suddenly the universe you were living in collapses, that you thought you were living in the sensible universe of cars and people and jobs and responsibilities, and suddenly that runs completely pulled from under your feet. And that was what happened to me when I was a young man, that I thought I was on a pathway through life where I was at school, I was doing well in sports, I was doing well in my studies. And then suddenly my spiritual experience pulled the carpet from under me. And suddenly all of those things to me became empty and meaningless. I was like, there's no point to struggle and strive for sporting success or for educational achievements, because I understood that I was not this physical body. I was not this character I was playing. I was some transcendent portion of infinite consciousness that was intimately and fundamentally significant in the universe, that's like, how does that help me in my day-to-day reality? So it does take some time, and that's why having a spiritual tradition or being involved with a spiritual community can be really, really powerful in those moments, because your old world in some way has fallen down, and you need to find some foundations to build your new. I mean, it's amazingly freeing, because suddenly you realize that all of those stories that you'd been given, you didn't get to choose, were not your stories. But then you don't know what your story is. So there's a period of time there where you need some support. And whether that's going to be from reading or listening, or really preferably finding a community of people that can say, hey, we've been here, we've been through that part of our journey, and we've found tremendous meaning on the other side. But it is meaning that has come from within. It's not meaning that has been given to us by culture and civilization. Instead, it's a meaning that has come from our own practice and our own illumination and our own realization.
What is that meaning for you?
So so that was really interesting, because, like, for example, sports was a thing. Like, I really felt, I was so strongly convinced that sport was an opiate of the masses. It was just to keep people, give people enough excitement that they wouldn't overthrow the whole system. That was really what I thought. And so I thought, yeah, look at all these idiots, watching their football team and cheering. And, it's like, they want you to do that so you don't rise up and, tear down the whole system. So that was kind of my position as a strongly anti-authoritarian, late teenager. But then it was amazing that I have come back to loving and appreciating sport in a way that is much more pure and profound than I could have ever imagined when I walked away from it. But so coming back to even something as simple as my running, I had thought that it was something that was providing validation, and it was something that I was going to show that I was worthy of being alive here on earth. If I could run faster than someone else, or win a medal or do something like that, it was like, yes, that was going to prove that me being alive was something that was worthwhile. But walking away from that, and letting go of all of those stories, and coming back to it and seeing it instead as a place or a space where I could explore my own consciousness, where I could explore my own motivations, I could explore the very furthest reaches of my own ability to experience life and all of its intensity. And it's become such a wonderfully profound and important part of my spiritual life, which I would have had no um, inkling of when I was a 15-year-old, before I had my
Yeah.
experience. But it definitely took some time to get there. So, I sympathize with the people who are going through this meaning crisis. But I think that's when I first found my spiritual community, and I started to hear people talk about the soul, and the journey of the soul, and I was like, oh, this, I was so hungry to hear people talking about life and reality in that sort of a way. And I think it's much easier to find that now. So this was like in the late 90s as well for me, and it was quite hard to find people, especially in the Western world, who had a conception of reincarnation and the journey of the soul and all of these types of things. So
Yeah.
yeah, I was really grateful to find that community, and I think for people now that it should be easier to live.
Definitely. Yeah, what I liked about Sri Chinmoy, about our teacher, is his idea of self-transcendence. And that gave me a lot of meaning in kind of connecting the outer world to my inner experience. Because the outer world, what is it? It's this three-dimensional place where we go to our work and where we eat and where we meet people. But it's also the field of manifestation of the soul's qualities. And that's very much how I've come to value the outer world, as something where you can actually become a better version of yourself every day. And so whether it's in sports, I also, like you, I'm a runner, and I was a very fanatic marathon runner maybe 10 years ago, and training and to improve my personal best, and not to beat somebody else. That was not the joy that I got. But if I could do better than I did, like, the previous race, I got some real joy out of that. It was not ego fed. I felt that joy really came from my soul. Like, I remember the first time I finished a marathon, and I trained for it, and it was a dedication. It took me months to prepare. And when I crossed that finish line, I was overwhelmed with this feeling of immense joy. And that was really the joy of self-transcendence. And this idea of self-transcendence is for me very much a vehicle for meaning, for making sense of the outer world. That is where you can, you know, if you have the quality, if you in your meditation you feel the quality of peace, or you feel the quality of love, or you feel the quality of joy or enthusiasm, what are you going to do with it? There's a whole world out there to prove, to show that, you know, manifest that enthusiasm, manifest that love and that kindness and that inner peace when you deal with other people. It's a way to really solidify those experiences, and that's when you really grow as a person, I think.
Yeah, it's a wonderful open blank canvas, the universe that we're living in, because it's so multi dimensional in so many ways. Like there's so many niches and so many worlds within the world. So there's the world of our society, but this our society is made up like of just an infinite layers of different worlds. So you've got the hospital world, you've got the port world, you've got the financial world, you've got this world, you've got that world, and then each side inside each of those worlds, there's all these smaller games and smaller games and smaller games within all of those worlds. And one of the great things is when you start to realize that you have the power and the ability to create your own meaning and your own game for yourself that's completely tailored to your own character, your own predisposition, your own qualities. And you can play that, and no one else even needs to know the game you're playing. You can be playing your own. I mean, obviously, society shows us a few games, which we've talked about, many times, the games of power and the games of, financial success and the games of, relationships, all of these types of games. But the thing is, there's no limit to the types of games that you could possibly create that are going to be meaningful for you. And you can live them out and you can have an incredibly successful life completely on your own terms. And no one else even needs to know. Like, you don't need to prove that to anyone else. And Sri Chinmoy was an absolute master of creating his own deeply meaningful, enjoyable games that he would play. And there were things like, okay, Sri Chinmoy loved poetry. So most people would think, oh, poetry is such a, it's such a wonderfully gentlemanly activity. You'll sit round and you'll consider some words, and you'll play with those words and try and create a beautiful image through those words. Sri Chinmoy, because he came from a background of a sportsman and he loved challenging himself, he's like, right, okay, how many poems can I write in 24 hours? And it's like, no one's ever really approached poetry with the mindset of a competitive athlete before. And it's so fascinating to see someone do that. And then you see how much joy he got, and you see how meaningful it was and transformative for the people who were there. I still hear people talk about it like, wow, like, there was this man, he sat there and for 24 hours solidly, he was just, just this flow of words and imagery and inspiration just flowed through him. And I think for the people who were there, saw something that very few people will ever see. But it was a game that no one else has ever played before. It's something completely new. And it's like, what could you think of? It doesn't need to be, it's the same in any way. But what games could you come up with in your own life that would be deeply meaningful to you and work with your particular setting and your particular set of skills and qualities? And
And there
so,
will be something that piques your interest. There will be something that calls out to you. You have to be kind of open to that.
yeah, and I remember for you when you you became the world record holder for one-handed clapping. And it's like
Exactly.
there's all these little games that you could take on, and people really responded to that though. It's like you can think, oh, that thing is too unusual or too niche. Like people only like it when you win a Formula One motor car race, or you win an Olympic gold medal in speed skating. These are very competitive games that are already well structured in our society. But these are not the only games. You became the world record holder for some period of time with one hand clapping. It got you a trip to China. It got you on the
Yes.
radio and interviewed by all sorts of people. So
So many television shows I had to visit and show my skill and talk about it. Like,
yeah,
it was something so quirky and funny
yeah.
that
It's like human
got a
beings
lot of
really
mileage out of that.
people like it, and they get joy when they see people not conforming to the mold of society. When they start going off and marching to the beat of their own drum. And I love seeing people do that. And that's the thing. When I find someone who is really deeply interested in anything, I love talking to them because there's a spirit in them that is alive and is engaged and is passionate. Like one of the most famous, or a viral guy on YouTube at the moment is that guy Francis, who is a British train spotter, and he's like the slightly um,
He's
interesting.
Irish.
Is he Irish? So
Yes.
yeah, so but you see the passion and the joy he gets when he sees a locomotive, a particular type, and a particular
Oh,
set.
no, I thought you're talking about this guy you sent me stuff from recently in Dublin, but that was a different guy, I
Yeah,
think.
so
Yeah.
yeah, this English guy, he is just the joy he gets, and people comment. They say, "My God, I wish I could find something that I could love as much as this man loves trains."
So what is it about? I don't know this guy.
It's just him at train stations, and he's waiting for particular trains to come through. And he starts telling you about the train. This is this particular locomotive that's coming through, and he's got a like a camera on his head, and you can kind of see his face from it's like a 360-degree camera, and you just see his excitement when the train comes through. It's like he almost like explodes with it's like he almost melts into a puddle of joy and excitement when the train comes through. And people just think, wow, I just so wish I could find something in my life that I could love as much as Francis loves trains. And so there is some things that when people are really looking and respond when they see someone finding a meaningful game. And in my own life, I've created this game that I love to play, which is the game of of being incredibly curious about people and the world around me, and it driving me to these extremes of traveling as much as I can, and visiting the far-flung places, and not so I can collect some particular types of experience, but just to see and experience the world through the eyes of the people who live there, and perhaps gain some wisdom from those insights. And I find that game so thrilling. And like even when I think about it, I'm leaving again in 3 weeks' time to begin my travels for the year. And even though I've been doing it for many years now, it's still equally thrilling for me. And I still can't believe it's happening. Like when I start to think, wow, in a few weeks I will be boarding a plane again and heading off onto this grand adventure. And I find that so thrilling. And it's not that there's some particular goal outcome I have in mind. There's like a real openness and curiosity, and for me, it's a game that resonates with my soul. It resonates with some deeper part of me, and I feel that that's how I can be of the most service to the world, by doing the thing that gives me the most joy and the most
Yeah.
makes my life feel the most meaningful.
Well, you're very good at that game, I have to say. So we're following your progress along. So
Yeah.
you're just wrapping it up for today. I have kind of 4 things that we talked about, kind of to help you integrate your spiritual breakthrough or spiritual awakening, and kind of prevent the spiritual ego from running amok with it. And one is gratitude, to
Mhm.
be grateful for the experience when it occurs. Really grateful makes you humble and makes you not overvalue or undervalue your life. The second one was oneness, to feel oneness or connection with the other people. Knowing, having that spiritual breakthrough, that you're part of something vast and that, transcends your own limited self. And that connects you to other people. And that also kind of puts the ego back in its place, like stops you from feeling superior. The third one is to find a spiritual community or a spiritual tradition, because if you're with like-minded souls and you're going through that, deeply transformative spiritual awakening process, it's really helpful to have a group of like-minded souls to share the experience with, and to also, put your feedback on the ground. Like when I had my troublesome spiritual crisis after that breakthrough, people in my center, in my meditation center, they were very concerned about me, and they had to put me back in my place and talk to me. And that was kind of painful sometimes, but it did help me to kind of find my footing again. So that does help a lot. And the fourth one we just talked about is to find meaningful games to play. And they don't have to be games that society is presenting to us, but you can find your own meaningful games that give you joy and give you meaning in your life. So those 4 strategies we talked about. And that kind of brings us to the end today. I think we covered all the bases. We'll have time for the aphorism next week. But did you have anything else to add to that?
No, the one thing, just when you were going through those 4 points, was with any great drama, you need all of the characters. And so I think that always resonates with me when I have a particular type of experience or I'm seeing the world in a particular way. I realize how dull the game would be if there was just, 8 billion versions of me seeing the world in the same way, trying to play the same sorts of games. The airports would be clogged with people flying to, certain places, and the whole thing would be far from ideal. Whereas if you can start to see that everyone is playing the role they are meant to play to make the game as full and rich and as interesting and as dynamic as possible, then you start to value everyone else's role. And there's one good idea that I'd like to just finish with, is that very often we think of way out people as being people who, some sort of, wild sort of spiritual character, who's, dances under the full moon and, does sacred ceremonies and this, that, or the other thing. That's what we would consider someone who was, really a far out character. So it's kind of quite a 60s term, like, whoa, he's a far out dude, that guy. But there's another way of looking at it, and I've heard this talked about as well by spiritual thinkers, is actually the most way out guy is the guy who's pretending the game is most real. So, it's perhaps some guy working in Wall Street and he's, killing himself to, try and earn his bonus. And he's gone way out in completely the different direction. He's gone way out into believing the story of materialism and, the financial gain, and that is the thing. And so when I see people who are really taking their role really seriously, it might be someone who is, an engineer or a computer program, whatever it is, and they're really into their role they play. And I think, wow, those people are so cool. That is a way out dude. The guy is so convinced of his character. And because you think you have to have a tremendous amount of bravery to get that way out. Because if you really are coming from a source of divine consciousness, the guy who's dancing under the full moon and, meditating and singing songs to God, he's probably a little bit closer to returning back home. And so the guy who's really brave is the guy who's really gone as far as he can in the other direction and really bought into the structure and the game that he's been given.
We salute the Gordon Geckos of this world.
Yes.
And we bid adieu to you, dear listeners. So thanks for joining us so far. And if you like our show, please subscribe. Please rate us on your favorite podcast app. Please do that for us. It helps tremendously. And we'll see you again next week with a new episode.